Welcome, everyone. Delighted to welcome you all here. I'm Jim Goldgeier, Dean of the School of International Service, and what a great treat it is to have our director of our Brussels program, Jerry Sheridan, here to talk about his new book, American Airmen in the Belgian Resistance, and Staff Sergeant Gerald E. Jerry Sorensen. And my colleague Michelle Egan is going to be providing some comments after Professor Sheridan delivers his remarks about the book. I just wanted to say how thrilled we are to have him here in D.C. I've had the good fortune to visit our program in Brussels on more than one occasion, and it is just a phenomenal program. I've really enjoyed the time I've had meeting students over there and then working with them when they get back here and watching them as they go on, even just in the 4 years that I've been here. The graduates who spend time in the program have just done so well and working in this area of transatlantic relations. We have a number of folks who are doing work transatlantic relations, private sector, working on issues related to the United States and Europe, and so it's just a real thrill. We had a wonderful event last year celebrating the 30th anniversary of the program, where we were hosted here by the Belgian ambassador, and it was just a wonderful ceremony. So Jerry has been working in Brussels since 1991 and has developed, as you know, programs dealing with both the European Union and NATO. In addition to his work as director of the Brussels Center, he serves as lecturer at the Netherlands Defense College and a frequent guest lecturer for various European and American audiences on transatlantic relations, the EU's common security and defense policy, and NATO. He's a member of the board of the Fulbright Commission Belgium and of the selection committee for the Fulbright Schumann Scholarship. And he is also president of the American Overseas Memorial Day Association in Belgium, has lots of other things that he's done. Prior to his work in the Brussels program, he also taught at our London semester program as well as here on the main campus. And he previously worked on Capitol Hill as well as at the University of Notre Dame. We're really proud for him that he has produced this book and are delighted that you guys have come to hear more about it. I regret that, as is often the case, I have another event to go to, and so I'm not able to hear more about the book, but Jerry was gracious enough to send me a copy. And I'm very much looking forward to reading it and learning from it. So Jerry, congratulations, and Michelle, thanks in advance for the comments you'll be providing. So, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dean Goldgeier. I'd like to begin with a little personal story about where this came from. In my capacity with as a volunteer for the American Overseas Memorial Day Association, I ran across in a government document an obscure reference to an American soldier buried in a civilian cemetery in Gonshorn. For the graduates of the program, you know that there are 19 communities in Brussels. This is one of the 19 communities in Brussels. And that's all I knew. I didn't know what cemetery, I didn't know anything else. So I went looking for the grave, and I chose the oldest cemetery I could find in the village. Went strolling through the cemetery. It's closed to new burials. Many of the tombs are overgrown. And I found a cross. And the cross in the back of the cemetery said, Gerald E. Sorensen, parentheses, USA, died for Belgium, with September 3rd, 1944 written over it. That was all I knew. But based on that information, I started doing some research, and the research led to the story that I'm about to tell you today. And this is a story not just about a man, not just about a soldier that did some great things during the war, but it's a story that reveals a lot about the transatlantic relationship of today, which is why I decided to write this story, to transmit it to future generations. Because if we do not remember the sacrifice of people like Sorensen and the reasons why Sorensen did what Sorensen did, our liberty in the future will definitely be endangered. So what's this all about? Well, Gerald is how he pronounced his name with a hard G sound, but he went by Jerry popularly. And he was the son, and which is one of the also maybe another reason why I got interested in the story. Jerry was the son of Luella and Ephraim Sorensen, and that's his sister Shirley in the back. He had two sisters out there. And he was born in Rose, Idaho, which is a tiny little village just north of Blackfoot, Idaho, which is just north of Pocatello, Idaho. And Ephraim Sorensen came from a very large family full of young men. And this is the Sorensen family of Ephraim is one of those young men in the photo. And his mother, Luella, came from a very large family of women. And yes, 3 of the Sorensen men married 3 of the Dean women, producing the children that you see today. And Jerry, in fact, grew up, and his father owned a farm next door to his brother's farm, Nephi. And this is a picture of one of the 2 farmhouses. They literally grew up next door to each other, had the 2 farmhouses next to each other. They were sheep farmers. They farmed their 2 farms collectively. The children grew up together. In fact, the children became so close to each other that they couldn't tell who was whose son and daughter because they were all just kind of one great big family. And this is the oldest photo of him that exists. He's on the left-hand side right there. That's his first cousin, Darwin, on the right-hand side. And Darwin and Jerry were just the best of friends growing up, but they were farm boys. You know, they didn't have the opportunity to play the way children know how to play today. They were always busy working on the farm. You know, as soon as they were old enough to tell the difference between a weed and a plant, they had the job of pulling weeds. When they were old enough to round up stray cows, they had the jobs of rounding up the stray cows and sheep. When they were old enough to use a tool, they got the job of repairing the fences. They had a life of hard work, and it was a value that was instilled upon Jerry at a very, very young age. But there was also another aspect of Jerry's character. This is his horse, by the way. I just throw that in there because I like the picture. So it was this building right here. Rose, Idaho was built around that structure. That is a church, and it's a church of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, who the rest of us know as Mormons. And Jerry's Mormon background was very important for understanding who he was. Not to belabor this in too much detail, but to put it in a nutshell, what Mormons basically, among the things that Mormons basically believe, is that service to God, service to family, and service to country are all exactly the same thing. So when you are serving your country, you are serving your God, you are serving your family. When you are serving your family, you are serving your country, you are serving your God. There's no distinction between these 3 things. And Jerry internalized these messages. And these were messages that would lead him to take some of the decisions that he did. Here's a copy of his LDS certificate if any of you are familiar with the faith. All right? By the way, I am not Mormon, just for the record, so that everybody knows. But I did learn to appreciate the values that the faith had to offer when I was there. He graduated from Pocatello High School in 1938 is when he graduated from Pocatello High School. Here's a photo of him as he graduated from high school. I took a nice visit to Pocatello and met with the great people there and learned a little bit about his high school career while I was there. From Pocatello, he decided, like his farmer who had moved into dairy farming at that point, that he wanted to become a dairy farmer, and he wanted to become a scientific dairy farmer, one that applied modern technologies to the field. And so he went to one of the leading schools of the nation at that time period in the field of bovine health, and that was the University of Idaho at Moscow. And here's a picture of him learning dairy health at the University of Idaho, growing up. And when he was in high school and everything, he had work all the time. He didn't get to play sports or stuff like that. He was a farmhand. But when he got to Idaho, for the first time in his life, he could actually do extracurricular activities. And he blossomed. He joined the agriculture club. He became the president of his 4-H society, which in those days, 4-H was principally about teaching college students the scientific methods of agriculture. He went on to become the president of Lambda Delta Sigma, which at that time period was a social organization for Mormon students. And he became a member of the Idaho Club. So from a boy who spent all this time working, he actually blossomed as a community leader and became the president of 2 of these organizations by the time that he graduated. But he graduated at a very difficult year. This is a picture of his graduation photo. In December of 1941, when he was in the first semester of his senior year, World War II broke out. Pearl Harbor had been bombed. President Roosevelt declared war on Germany. Gerald Sorensen was not going to sit back and just wait for the war to catch up with him. He was going to serve his family, he was going to serve his God, and he was going to serve his country. And he volunteered to join the United States Army Air Force. Why did he volunteer to join the United States Army Air Force? Because he wanted to be a pilot. Now, if you know his background, this is a bizarre story. This is a farm boy that had never driven anything more complicated than a tractor. He had never driven a car. He had never been inside of an airplane, let alone tried to fly one. Yet he wanted to become a pilot just the same. Why? Because it appeared magical. He knew the earth, and this was going to take him to the sky. So he volunteered for something called the Aviation Cadet Program, which was designed to take land-bound young men like Jerry and turn them into qualified military pilots to take the war to the enemy. And this is a picture of him in his uniform as an aviation cadet. The aviation cadet program passed through 3 stages. Stage 1 was primary flight school, where you actually learned how to fly an airplane. And he went to, well, Santa Ana is where he started out, where he did his initial classification. This is the Santa Ana Army Air Base there. This is him in his first class, right there in the middle, in the squadron at Santa Ana. And then he went to primary flight school, where he learned how to be a pilot. And this is what Jerry looked like after he completed his first, after he completed his first solo flight afterwards. And he was quite an accomplished pilot at this stage in his career. In fact, he won the school's merit award for having a perfect flying record. He never made a mistake in the primary flight school. And from primary flight school, he would then go on to basic flight school, where you would learn not to fly military aircraft as opposed to just being a civilian instructor. And he did that at the Merced Army Air Base, which is not far from Yosemite. This is a picture of his squadron at the Merced Army Air Base. But unfortunately, at some point along the way, 3rd week, he made a mistake. And that is, he temporarily lost control of his aircraft in making a landing. It wasn't a serious mistake, but at that point in his military training, he was supposed to have 100% mastery of his aircraft. And he, what was called at the time, washed out of the aviation cadet program and was unable to become a pilot. Now, this was actually not a source of embarrassment. Of the people that entered the aviation cadet program when Sorensen did, 75% washed out. And at this stage in the training process, 50% washed out. So he was in good company. He wasn't alone. The program was designed, you almost had to have an innate sense of flying in order to succeed in the program. But he was no longer going to be a pilot. Instead, he would receive his training as an enlisted man, and he was sent to the Amarillo Army Air Base in Amarillo, Texas, all right, for training as an enlisted man. A lot of people who washed out of the program became disheartened. They, just wanted to do basic jobs, repairing airplanes and desk jobs, or maybe military police. Sorensen said, no, I joined the military because I want to take the fight to the enemy. And he volunteered to serve as an aerial gunner on aircraft that were bombing Europe. He still wanted to fly, and he still wanted to fight the enemy from the air. So he voluntarily entered into the service to become an aerial gunner. And being at Amarillo presented a very unique opportunity for him, namely Nora Lee Morton. Now, Nora Lee was a rather interesting character. Her father was a World War I veteran, and her father experienced the worst of World War I, poison gas attacks, poison gas attacks, poison gas attacks. And although he was never officially wounded, the poison gas left its scar upon him. And he suffered what today we would call PTSD. He was governed by a terribly violent temper. One moment could be the sweetest person on planet Earth. The next moment could just turn in all his fury against everybody around him. And he would often disappear for weeks or months at a time, leaving crops to rot in the field and things of this nature. Those days, they didn't know what PTSD was. All they just knew was that he wasn't quite right after the war. But nevertheless, he had it. And he was married to Nanny Mae. And Nanny Mae, Nora Lee's mother, she couldn't quite handle it. Now, to give you a sense, this is their home. They basically lived in a shack in the middle of Amarillo. Very, very poor background that they came from. That's her dog, Lady, is the name of the dog in the background right there. And, Nanny Mae couldn't handle it. And so when the father would go off and, do the crazy things that he'd done, Nora Lee took responsibility for her family. This is Nora Lee in front of her house in 1943, right? And she had 3 brothers, and she personally took on the responsibility from the age of about 10 or 11 on of raising her 3 brothers. Yes, Mom was around and everything, but her 3 brothers to this day credit their upbringing to what Nora Lee gave them. So Nora Lee herself was a woman of principles. She believed in hard work. She had considerable faith. She believed in responsibility. She was disappointed by what her parents had done and was determined to have a better life than her parents. So for Nora Lee and Jerry, when they met, this was love at first sight. These were people that looked at the world the same way. They shared the same values. They had the same work ethic. They had the same everything. They basically wanted to have a farm together, and they met at a 4th of July social in 1943 and fell madly in love. Jerry then went off to gunnery school. This is him in Las Vegas, learning where he's in the flight suit that he would wear on the B-17s. This is a copy of him in the tail gun position of the B-17 in gunnery school when he was learning how to man that position on the aircraft. And then he went off to Florida, where the crew came together and did their training. And Nora Lee made every effort to get down to Florida that she could. She got a job at New Orleans, and she was able to take bus and train connections to get there. So this is a picture of Nora Lee visiting her in New Orleans, and the two of them together, you know, enjoying the sunshine and everything in Tampa, in Florida, where the training was taking place. And one day in January of 1944, he asked Nora Lee to marry him, and she said yes, and this is a copy of her engagement photo. I'll come back to this photo a little bit later on in my discussion. So right at Pier overlooking the sea there at St. Petersburg, Florida. This is a picture of her showing off her ring, so you can she was quite proud of it. All right, I'll also make reference to this dress before too much longer. And then when he got his orders to ship out to Europe, he decided he was going to marry Nora Lee before he shipped out to Europe, and in March 20th, 1944, he married Nora Lee Sorensen at a private ceremony at her family's home, his family's home in Pocatello, Idaho. Her family didn't make it up for it. Her family, frankly, didn't quite approve because of his religious faith, but you know, that's a long story altogether. And then he was supposed to have a 2-week furlough, but the furlough was canceled after the second day, and after 3 days of marriage, he shipped off for Europe with his crew of the B-17, and that was the last time that Nora Lee would ever see him alive again. So they were only married 3 days together. So this is the crew that he joined up with, the crew of the Wolverine, a B-17. Jerry is right there. Captain Dingledine is right there, was his name. Dingledine, he pronounced it, but you know, okay. It's neither here nor there. Here's a photo. There's the crew as well in front of their B-17. And this is a picture that he took on the flight over to Europe that he took from one of the airplanes that he was flying next to, so you can get a sense of what the B-17 was like in flight. And they went to England. They joined the 96th Bomb Group. The 96th Bomb Group was a battle-hardened unit. They had suffered many, many casualties. In the course of April 1944, they suffered 24 bombers that were lost. That was the equivalent of 2 full squadrons. Although they would not know it at the time, by May of 1944, they would lose even more of that number, including the bomber that Jerry Sorensen was on. And one day, they did a bombing mission. These are photos from the internet. These are not his aircraft, but I just wanted to illustrate the bombing mission. He was on a bombing mission to Metz in France. They flew over Belgium, flew over Luxembourg. The aircraft initially caught some anti-aircraft fire over Luxembourg, lost an engine. They delivered the bombs on the target, started to return, caught more anti-aircraft fire, and eventually began to lose height, lose height, lose height. B-17s were fantastic aircraft. The men that flew them absolutely believed in the B-17, but the B-17 needed 4 engines to fly. It could fly on 3, but it could not fly on 2, and the anti-aircraft fire had taken out 2 of the engines. So the captain gave the order for the crew to evacuate the aircraft, and they bailed out over Belgium, and he landed near a town called Silly, S-I-L-L-Y, in Belgium. Now, when he landed there the next morning, he spent the night out in the woods hiding from the Germans. The Germans had seen the airplane go down. They knew that a B-17 had a crew of 9. They wanted to find these 9 people. But the Germans were not alone in trying to find this crew of 9. So too was a Belgian resistance organization named the Comet Line. There was no one overarching organization called the Belgian Resistance. Instead, there were multiple smaller Belgian organizations that were all involved in the resistance with certain degrees of cooperation with each other and to a small degree with certain degrees of competition with each other as well. The Comet Line's job was to rescue downed Allied airmen and return them to England, because it took months to train Jerry as an aerial gunner. It took months and even years to train experienced pilots. So when a crew went down, the Allies lost more than just an airplane. They lost an experienced crew that knew how to take the war to the enemy. So what the Comet Line did is it took Allied soldiers and tried to get them back to England. But how do you do that? The North Sea is in the way of Belgium to England. And the answer is Spain was neutral. So the Comet Line took downed Allied airmen to the south of Belgium, across France, across the Pyrenees Mountains to Spain, where they could turn them over to the British, and from there they could be returned to England. And the Comet Line returned approximately 1,000 pilots to England through this fashion. But it was a very large organization. There were some 2,000 Belgian volunteers that did this. Some were spotters that looked for downed Allied airmen. Others were people that, for example, gave them the papers and the civilian clothes and the things they would need to survive in occupied Belgium so the Nazis wouldn't see them. Others were guides that would take them to a series of safe houses. This is the Le Poivre family. The Le Poivre family had a farm at Espinette, not far from Silly, where basically they would process the downed Allied airmen, take away their military uniforms, and give them civilian clothes so the Germans wouldn't see them. But then you had to transport them from place to place. And often to do this, the Comet Line used young women like Sylvie Le Poivre, right here, who was the daughter of the family. And she was about the same age as these downed Allied airmen, so she would pose as the girlfriend of the airmen. So that if the Germans would stop him, the airman could claim that he couldn't speak or whatever, and she could do all the speaking on their behalf. So he got his forged paperwork from the Le Poivre family, and they started to move him to Brussels. Now at this point, it's May of 1944. It was clear that the Allied invasion of D-Day was going to occur. So rather than take the dangerous trek of moving airmen from Belgium to Spain all across occupied France, they decided instead to hold the Allied airmen in Brussels in various safe houses that were around. And passing through 6 or 8 houses along the way, through Odette Gerspray. Odette was the guide that Jerry had. By the way, I'll just detour on her because she was a very interesting character. She was 20 years old, the age of many of the young ladies sitting here in the room today. Her father was British. Her mother was Belgian. And she volunteered for the resistance in the Comet Line. This was highly, highly dangerous work. The Nazis' penalty for assisting downed Allied airmen was death. And several hundred Comet Line volunteers were executed by the Nazis across the war. Odette took extreme, extreme risks for these individuals. And Odette led them to the home of Arthur and Clemmy Abales. This photo dates from after the war. They looked much younger at the time period that the Sorensens came into their room. Arthur Abales, he had belonged to the German army in World War I, stubbornly defended Liège as the Germans attacked, basically holding up the German advance in World War I by 5 days, which was critical amount of time that allowed the British and the French to fall in line to oppose the invasion. He was wounded in the leg, spent the rest of his war in a German prisoner of war camp. He was an interesting character because he spoke 4 languages. He was completely fluent in French, his native language, completely fluent in Dutch, the language of his mother, completely fluent in German, and completely fluent in English. And so the Germans put him to work as an interpreter in the prisoner of war camps where he was. This put him into contact with prisoners from all over the continent of Europe. And the more he learned, the more he grew, his hatred grew for what the oppressive power of the Germans had done across the continent. He learned about the introduction of poison gas. He learned about the introduction of the flamethrower. He learned about the way young men and women across the continent were impressed into service for the German army. And when the war was over with, he became even more patriotic than he was before the war. He became eventually the president of his local Veterans Association. And he instilled in his children, Jenny Abales, originally known as Janine, and his child, Roger Abales, patriotism and the ability to speak English. And when the Germans came back in 1940, I should say when the Nazis came in 1940 and invaded Belgium, Roger Abales decided that what he wanted to do was escape from Belgium, go to England and join the Royal Air Corps, like many other young men had did at the time. He never had the opportunity to do that. But what he could do, and what his father could do, is join a couple of other Belgian resistance organizations. They joined the Front d'Indépendance. This was a group that engaged in a lot of clandestine press activities. Arthur would basically at night listen to BBC radio broadcasts and translate it into French and write it so that the people in Belgium could understand the truth of what was happening and not what the Nazi propaganda machine was telling them. They engaged in, the Germans imposed a labor conscription, forcing young men to go to work in Germany. And he composed tracts trying to convince Belgians not to do this, to go into hiding, that the Front d'Indépendance would shelter them from the Nazis. He even engaged in certain armed activities against collaborators. Jenny, his daughter, who I got to know as a result of this research, said his father never really talked about it very much, but there were certain nights she knew her father had a gun when he would leave the house, come back the next morning, and then a day or two later at the dinner table they would have a discussion about a certain justice being done to a collaborator a couple nights before. So everybody knew exactly what was happening. Roger also volunteered for the Independence Front. Originally he was in high school when the war broke out, so his first couple of years was engaged in distributing the clandestine press. But he eventually joined the Secret Army on the right-hand side, which is an armed Belgian resistance organization that was the army of Belgium, the Belgian government in exile, but on the ground in Belgium. and he did his exploits in the secret army. So when Sorensen was brought to this home, he was brought into the home of a very patriotic Belgian family, much like him. A very patriotic Belgian family that detested what the Nazis stood for and what they were doing to their country, just like him. Okay? And he became friends with them. Because Arthur spoke English and insisted that his children speak English, the language barrier wasn't there, although Jerry went out of his way to learn French, and he actually didn't do too bad for 2 months inside of the house. And there was letters that he's written in French that I've seen that he remembered. The people that served with him remembered his ability to do it. But he became very, very close to the Belgian family. I mean, basically, he was sheltered in the home. He couldn't go out and leave, because if you go out and leave, the Nazis might find you. If the Nazis would find you, if you were not a soldier not in uniform, you could be summarily executed. Absolutely no problem at all, not to mention the fact that the family could be executed as well for this. So effectively, he was under house arrest for the summer of 1944, and the advantage of that is he spent the summer of 1944 talking to Roger, talking to Jenny, talking to the Bales family, getting to know them, and they became very, very, very close over that summer. By July of 1944, Jerry was calling the Bales family Ma and Pa. They were calling him son. He was calling Jenny and her brother Roger, brother and sister. And mixed and dropped into the mix as well was another American aviator by the name of Bernard McManaman, who everybody went by Mac. You can see on Mac that he was he was a very fun-loving character. Those of you that have read the book have seen the stories that I talked about it. And the three boys together, got to be the best of friends. They got to call each other the Three Musketeers. And there's a whole bunch of photos that the Bales took, again, at extreme personal risk. These were actually taken during the occupation, developed by a friend of Arthur's. And, had the Nazis caught any of this, they would have all been dead. All right? But they did it anyway. And here you can see the four of them out there having a really good time. This is Jerry on the right there. This is Roger. This is Mac. And this is Jenny. All right? Now, Jerry was 24 years old at the time period, had a wife, ineligible. Mac, on the other hand, was 20 years old and something of a flirt. And although Jenny was just 16 years old, she was smitten by this boy, smitten badly, okay? And he played with her heart beyond all recognition. Nothing happened to them in the summer of 1944. But nevertheless, it was very, very clear, and even from the notes that were left behind and the notes that are written on the back of the pictures and everything, that they had a flirty thing going on throughout that summer, but under the watchful eyes of her parents. So nothing really horrible actually happened as a result of that. Right? Here's a picture of Jerry and Mac with Mrs. Bales at the time, and here they are with the family rabbits, who also figured into the picture of the story a little bit later on. And then what happened? Oh, by the way, Belgians at that time period didn't have showers. And Arthur went out of his way to make the American boys feel home. And one of the things that he did is one day on a sunny day in Belgium, which as my alumni know happens all the time, he rigged up a shower at the outside so that they could enjoy an American shower just like they were home. And here's a couple of photos of them, messing around in the sunshine and enjoying the summer. All taking place under the occupation of Nazis. If somebody had denounced them, this was an extreme, extreme personal risk that all these people took. Yet they took that risk because of what the Bales took that risk because of what the Americans were doing for their country. All right? And Arthur, being ever the patriot, decided that on the 4th of July, 1944, they would celebrate America's independence. Food was rationed. It was very difficult to come by, but somehow, I know the photo's bad, but that's all I had to work with. Arthur managed to find some beef, and it was the closest thing to American food they could find. So they prepared an American dinner. Jerry and Mac taught the Bales the words to the American national anthem, and they tried to sing it while they were there. The Bales attempted to teach them the words to the Belgian national anthem, with less success, but nevertheless they did. So here they are celebrating the independence of the United States of America in the Bales home on the 4th of July, 1944, with Jenny right there, Mrs. Bales, and Mac and Roger. And this was great until August of 1944. And what happened in August of 1944? The Allies had broken through in Normandy. France was going to fall completely. It was going to be liberated soon. It was very clear that the American and British armies were going to be in Belgium soon, and that the Germans, at least temporarily, were going to be forced out of the country. You would think that the Germans would get out of town while the getting was good, or somehow ease up on the repression. And in reality, exactly the opposite happened. The Nazi repression of Belgium increased. They attempted to extract everything they could from the country. They attempted to extract money. They attempted to extract food. They attempted to extract especially young men to go to work in the factories so that German men could serve in the front line fighting the Allies in the cross. And these are the pictures of the labor conscription with propaganda photos encouraging young men to go to work in the factories in Germany because they were fighting the Bolsheviks, after all, to free up German men to go fight the Bolsheviks. And then sometimes, as you can see in this truck right here, the Nazis would just do things like go to a football game on a Sunday afternoon, wait for all the young men to show up, and then just round them up and cart them off to Germany in a truck. Okay? And the Nazis went looking for Roger Abels. Now, they had no idea that there were 2 American airmen in the home, but they did know that there was a young Belgian of labor draft age that was there. And they went looking for him. And the Abels realized that it would be only a matter of time until they showed up and searched the house and found the Americans. So now all 3 young men were fugitives and had to get out of there. Roger, belonging to the Secret Army, managed to arrange for his transfer to another part of the Secret Army near the town of Silly, where Jerry was originally shot down. And the 3 musketeers, as they called, this is another story I'll come to in a second. The 3 musketeers at the time set off to join the Secret Army. I should also note that in August of 1944, a mini civil war broke out in Belgium between the collaborators and the Nazis. And it was really a horrible period in the history of that country. And of course, they went to fight. These are Flemish collaborators there. These are Francophone collaborators there. And this is some of the resistance grabbing a collaborator, just random photos from the internet so you get the idea of what the picture is all about. But Belgium was at war. But it was at war with itself at this point. And Jerry and Roger went out and joined the Secret Army. He was sheltered during this period of time with a Van Delft family that had a chateau farm in the area. Their farm was used as drop zones for the British who would drop off supplies to the Belgian resistance. The Van Delfts had 5 children, as you can see right there. Jerry loved children. Eventually he wanted to have children himself, and so struck up a fantastic relationship with the Van Delft family. And he, Roger, and Mac spent the summer, August of 1944, engaged in the Belgian resistance. They took parachute drops from England, parachute drops of arms, communications materials, TNT, things of this nature to harass the Germans. They did intelligence of where German units were and sent that intelligence back to London so that they would know where to bomb. And they engaged in lots of acts of sabotage along the way while they were there. And then this, by the way, I went too fast. This is a captured German car that this resistance army unit caught. This is Cesar von Herwegen sitting on the car, captured about the same time that Jerry was with the unit. Cesar is one of my sources for the book and knew Sorensen rather well in the thing, but I just love the photo. The men of the Secret Army, they were proud of this. They got themselves a German car in the middle of all this. But on September 3rd, 1944, the Nazis were in full retreat across Belgium. Notice that their primary method of transportation at this point was the horse and cart. The cars were a premium. And Jerry and Roger's unit was ordered to go to the village of Mark in Engine and engage and harass the Germans in the retreat and to try to get them to surrender or give up their arms so that the Allies could capture even more arms. And they went to this village of Mark. Along the way with their Secret Army unit, either Jerry or Roger's bicycle, they were traveling by bicycle, developed a mechanical problem. They don't know whose bike it was, but the rest of the unit went on down to the road to pick up their pre-assigned positions. Jerry and Roger stopped to repair the bicycles. And as they were repairing the bicycles, it was an intersection with 2 buildings on either side. They saw a slow-moving German car come right across the intersection full of German officers. All right? This was the moment they were waiting for. They were in combat with the Nazis. And I'm sure they didn't think about it. They picked up their guns and they fired at that German car. But unbeknownst to them, there was a column of 300 SS men behind that car. And they soon tore around the corner chasing after them. Jerry and Roger took off running. Bullets pockmarked the streets around them as they took off down the road. They knew they would be shot in the back if they continued to run. So they took up a position next to a rabbit hutch, returned fire. There was a gun battle of about 10 minutes that took place between the 2 young men and the Germans that surrounded them. But these German SS had seen some time on the Russian front. They eventually surrounded the position. They threw inside a grenade. The grenade blew up. It wounded Roger in the back, Jerry in the neck, and they died together, side by side, gun in hand. And the first eyewitness that came on the scene noted that as they laid there on the ground, their blood blended together as it drained into the soil of Belgium that would soon be free. Right? They were dead. And they were brought back, and this was, by the way, 15 minutes later, the British Army came down that road, and the village was liberated. 15 minutes later. All right. So this is Jenny with Mac. Mac actually, he was further up the road. He had no idea that the combat had taken place. So as the British showed up, he jumped on the front of the first British tank that came down the road and hitchhiked a ride all the way back to Brussels. And all the airmen in Brussels were required to report to the Hotel Metropole, the ones that had been in hiding. So Jenny took him down to the Hotel Metropole. But this photo, as you'll see, was taken after they finally learned that Jerry and Roger were dead. You can see the expression on Mac's face right there. I mean, this is a man who's lost two of his best friends in the world. And Jenny, who is, she's sad, but she's very proud to be next to her American liberator along the way. The ceremony, this is the caskets in the Abale's home. This is Jerry's casket being loaded onto the hearse. And they were buried at the community cemetery in Gonshorn, where I found the grave and began the story at. Right? This is what the grave looked like in 1945, right? Surrounded by lots of monuments left by various Belgian veterans associations and well-wishers, to my dear American brother, written there that Jenny left that plaque along the way, always decorated with flowers back in the 1940s and 50s. Right? And then there was Nora Lee. Nora Lee had stood behind at Pocatello with Jerry's parents while he was off fighting the war. She had had no news from him since he was shot down in May of 1944. She found out in December of 1944 that in fact he had been killed, and her entire life that she had been planning for, of course, had been shattered. And this was a photo that was taken of her very, very shortly after she had received the news, officially received the telegram of Jerry's death that was through there, and very gaunt. You can see the expression on her face. I mean, her life was devastated, particularly in those days. If you were a woman, you had to have a husband, in those days. After the war, she came back to Belgium in 1947, and the Belgians treated her like royalty. So here's a picture of her among the members of the Secret Army unit that Jerry had served with. This is Cesar von Herwegen here, again, the young man that was on the car, and was one of the sources of the books. He was very proud of that photo. And the local townspeople, everywhere she went, put on great big patriotic manifestations, demonstrations for her. So sure she is at Gonshorn, the town of Gonshorn. They had a picture of Jerry on the wall, decorated everything in the red, white, and blue. Here she is meeting the mayor of the local town that was there. If you've been to Belgium, you can't just have a ceremony. It has to be followed by a great big banquet. So they had a great big banquet in her honor with a wine flowed, and everybody had a good time getting to know each other. And it was just really overwhelming for her. They also in Gonshorn renamed a street after her, Sergeant Sorensen Street, as it is to this day. This is what the street sign looked like immediately after the war with Claim Me a Bales next to it that was right there. And then they went to Mark, the place where Jerry was killed. So this is Nora Lee and Jenny at the ceremony in Mark that was held. This is them walking down the street with Commander Nerinx, who was the commandant of the Secret Army unit at the time period. Here you are again with Nerinx and Nora Lee and Jenny on the way down. And then this was the spot at which Jerry was killed, where Nora Lee deposed flowers at that time period. Before she went back to Belgium, she was awarded several Belgian military awards, the Croix de Guerre. It wasn't for her, it was for Jerry. So posthumously, he was awarded things like the Croix de la Guerre and one of the highest Belgian military honors, the Order of Leopold. And I'll show you a picture of that before long. All right, also this received a great deal of press attention at the time period, and one of the things I discovered in my own research is that much of this press attention, they didn't actually pay much attention to factual detail. So when I sat down to read, to do this history, I decided I was going to set the historical record straight and really tell the story of what actually happened and not some of the more fanciful things that appeared in the press at that time period. But you can see that it got a great deal of attention at the time. The grave was well known for a number of years, but then people moved on. And as people moved on, people forget. And by the time you get to 2004, when I first discovered the grave, it had been largely forgotten. There were only a few people that remembered, one of which was the veterans of the Secret Army. This is a monument that they erected in 1947. Nora Lee was there for the inauguration of this monument. And every year, the veterans of the Secret Army organization come together and they hold a ceremony on the date closest to September 3rd to recall Sorensen's and Abale's sacrifice on that date. I've been a regular attendee at the ceremony since 2004. And then the members, though, who actually knew him slowly have died off. This was Mr. Leclerc, who was one of the sources of my book, served with him. He just died, unfortunately, last August. Nowadays, there's only 2 members of that organization left. One is Cesar von Harwegen. So this is me presenting Cesar with a copy of the book, same Cesar that was on the car and everything at the United States Embassy a few months ago. So Cesar is still very much there. Leon Allard is the second one, and he's not doing so well in health. But they remembered him. But, that's just a handful of old Belgian people in Salee. Who else remembered him? Well, the Sorensen family remembered him. Last May, they came to Belgium for Memorial Day. One of the things that my association, the AOMDA, does is we hold ceremonies at each of the American graves in Belgium. And 17 members of the Sorensen family came over from the United States last May for a ceremony that was held there. This is the United States ambassador to Belgium at the time. This is the local mayor, and this is Lieutenant General David R. Hogue, 3-star U.S. Army general, that showed up for this very small cemetery in the middle of nowhere for the ceremony to remember Sorensen's sacrifice that took place that was there. They also tried to recreate Nora Lee's visit in 1947 last May. So here's a little march that we did through the town of Gonshorn to get to the reception at the town hall where the mayor gave his big speech and thanked the Sorensen family and everything. So they really went out of their way to make the Sorensen family feel welcome there. All right? And here they were. I took them on a tour of where Sorensen had served and everything in front of that monument as a group that next day. This was Evelyn White, or is Evelyn White. Evelyn was Jerry's first cousin, the maid of honor in his wedding. I visited her in Arizona at that time period, and it was really spectacular in the research. She came over, and this is Evelyn with Sylvie Lepoivre, the lady I talked about that helped shelter Jerry along the way. I should point out that of the 6 or 8 families that sheltered Jerry, 2 of them were ultimately arrested by the Nazis and put to death. The Lepoivre family would have been, except they were arrested about a day and a half before the liberation, and the resistance managed to keep them alive. And they survived, thanks to the actions of the Belgian resistance. But had the Belgian resistance not done that, that family likewise would have been completely wiped out along the way. And then there was Jenny Abales. Jenny's original name was Janine, but Jerry, when he walked into the house, being from Pocatello, Idaho, called her Jenny. She adopted the nickname. She loved it so much she insisted that everybody call her Jenny from then on. She even legally had her name changed to, get this, Jenny Roger Jerry Abales. She took the name of her 2 Belgian brothers, and that was her legal name at the time of her death. This is her at the Memorial Day ceremony in 2007. Jenny remembered as well, and she was the primary source of the information about the summer of '44. I spent hours in conversation with her over the years when she was alive, and Jenny never married. Jenny never married for a couple of reasons, one of which is she really was devastated by the loss of her brother, by the loss of both of her brothers. And this is a copy of Jenny with her mother at the grave shortly after the war. They went every day to the grave to pray, and Jenny did as long as her health permitted later on into life. And the other reason why, she was in love with Mac. He came back and visited in 1948. This time, she was 18 and fully eligible. This time, he was 22 and still very much a flirt. And romance, in fact, did bloom between the two. But Mac himself suffered his own form of PTSD. His friends, his brothers, he came to consider the brothers, had died in that battle. When he came back in '48, he actually came back as a man looking for ghosts. And he visited the places where they were, and he just was completely unhappy. Jenny, if he had said, come back to America with me, she would have done it immediately. But Mac, he was just in a completely different world. In civilian life, he couldn't hold a real job. But what he did do is he joined the United States then Air Force Reserve after the war. When the Korean War broke out, he was called up into active duty. In the Army, he got along, no problem. He could live the military life. And he again became a tail gunner on a bomber that was shot down over Incheon in North Korea on the 2nd of September, 1953, almost 7 years to the date after Jerry and Roger were killed, and his body has never been found, so he's been presumed to die. And Jenny never married. As Nora Lee told me live, no other man except Mac would ever do. She wanted nobody else for her entire life. She even became a stewardess. I'm sorry if I'm going a little bit too long. I hope this isn't a problem. She became a stewardess for Sabena, okay? And that's very telling because Sabena was the Belgian national airline. It's telling because, A, she took to the air, just like her Roger had done, and just like Roger had wanted to be a pilot, Jerry was a pilot. This is her way to be in the air. Also, she spoke English, which by the standards of those days were rare in Belgium. So she got the transatlantic flight, so she got to go to the United States all the time. And she was in contact with Nora Lee, and even they visited with each other on the other side. And the best part for her, so Jenny told me, stewardesses of Sabina were not allowed to be married. So there was no pressure of having to find another guy. So she could be in love with her dead, dear Mac, which is very sad by the standards of today. But the woman never left 1944. When I visited her in her home was a museum. Everything in the house was exactly as it was when, during the war. When her mother died in 1980, she left the bedroom exactly as it was. Do you remember that dress of Nora Lee with the wedding ring right here? Okay? Nora Lee gave her that dress. It was still hanging in her closet in 2011 when she died. You know, I mean, she never moved on beyond that, which was very much a tragedy. But it affected her more than anybody else in the story. By the way, I meant to go back to well, I'll come back to it in a second. Right? This is Nora Lee, the other character, all right, the wife. These were the military honors that she was given. So this photo was taken just before she left Belgium in 1947. She wanted to stay in Belgium, but she couldn't get a job there, as anybody in this room who's tried knows. She didn't speak French. It was as difficult then as it is today to live there, and so eventually she decided to do the responsible thing and return home. Along the way home, she stopped in Pocatello, Idaho, gave all of the personal effects that she had been given for Jerry, like all these medals, to Jerry's family. And then she kept the things that she had been given as a personal gift as her home and went on to Texas. And in Texas, there was a young man waiting for her who had fallen in love with her, but she was still in love with her dead husband. And eventually she said, okay, my husband's not going to come back. And she gave that relationship a chance. They eventually got married, and they produced 3 fine young men, okay, who are the Morton brothers, who I also got to know as a result of the book. This is me visiting her in 2008. I put this up here for a couple of reasons. One is I showed up. She was at the very, very beginning of Alzheimer's at this stage, but she was very lucid, and she still had all of her faculties ahead of me. Her family they knew about the Sorensen story, but they didn't really talk about it. You don't talk about your mom's first husband very much. And when I showed up at that house for the first time, okay, they were a little bit suspicious. Who are these people coming from Belgium? This is in Dumas, Texas, north of Amarillo. We are in the middle of the Texas Panhandle. I mean, this is as remote United States of America as you can possibly get, okay? And I'm sure they had guns lurking somewhere just to make sure we were on the safe side, all right? And Nora Lee, you know, when we showed up at the house, all right, first thing I noticed was on the porch were 3 hand-painted flags. One was a flag of Texas, the other was a flag of the United States of America, and the third was a flag of Belgium. Nora Lee did that right after 9/11. All right? So in the event, in the aftermath, the worst attack on American soil since Pearl Harbor, she immediately linked her patriotism in the middle of Texas to this small little country in Belgium. All right? I visited her again last December and gave her a copy of the book. All right? Again, she's in an advanced state of Alzheimer's for the first 5-10 minutes of our conversation. She didn't really understand what was happening. So we started going through the photos with her 2 sons that were there with me, and then we hit that photo of the engagement that I showed you at the beginning, and all of a sudden everything came back. And for the last 10 minutes of that conversation, she was lucid. She was thankful. This is her after she's finally realized what had happened in the thing. You know. So where does this bring me? This is the grave today, and this is what it looks like. So this is Roger on the left, died for the country. Gerald Sorensen, USA, died for Belgium. This is a plaque that Nora Lee left behind in 1947 when she visited. This is Arthur Bales, Roger's natural father, Jerry's adopted father, who had himself buried between them after he died in 1970. This is a monument that was sculpted by one of Roger's friends, showing the Croix de la Guerre, which Jerry and Roger had been posthumously awarded after the war. Photo of Roger, photo of Jerry on the other side. Which brings me to the final lesson that I wanted to kind of share with you before ending this thing. Why did I write the book? I wrote the book because of this grave, and this grave says everything you need to know about it. You know, Jerry and Roger were very, very different individuals. Jerry was a farmer from Pocatello, Idaho, and a Mormon that at least at the beginning in May of 44 spoke nothing but English. Roger was Bruxellois, Francophone, disaffected Catholic, drank wine, was a normal, Belgian that, any of us know who's lived in Belgium. These two individuals had absolutely nothing in common with each other, yet they recognized each other, the common values that they did have, their attachment to liberty, their hatred for what the Nazis were doing to their country, the barbarity of the attack. And they strongly believed that all free people had to stand together in the face of tyranny or we would lose our liberties. I mean, all Roger and Jerry had to do in the summer of 1944 was hide. The Americans were coming. Okay, they would be liberated. If Roger laid low and avoided the labor subscription, if Jerry had laid low and not done anything like almost all of their compatriots did, none of the other Americans joined the Belgian resistance. Very few of the Belgian young men that age joined the resistance. They would have been alive today, all right? But they didn't. They knew they had a responsibility to defend our freedom and to take an active role in that struggle. And that is ultimately why they died, which brings me back to Nora Lee. 2001. How many years later? She has a husband, 60 years, and a family and everything else. Her first instinct after 9/11 was that all free peoples had to stand together to face this new form of tyranny that we faced in the world. The gut instinct was the Transatlantic Alliance. And that's when I knew that the story had to be told. Because this is not just a nice story about a soldier that lived during the war. This is a story about the values that underpin the Transatlantic Alliance that exists to this day. And if we do not forget, Americans and Europeans, that we have more in common with each other than we do against the rest of the world, we are going to be in trouble in the near future. I mean, it's easy to sit back in America and take our freedoms for granted. But in 1942, Jerry knew that you could not take our freedoms for granted. And that lesson remains valuable for all time. So if you walk in the silence of that cemetery, this is what this is telling us. Roger Bales died for his country. Gerald Sorensen died for Belgium. It is with that pleasure, by the way, just a short note, we do a Memorial Day ceremony every year. If any of you happen to be in Belgium on the 25th of May, come to the ceremony. On that note, it is my pleasure to introduce Professor Michelle Egan from the School of International Service here. Michelle and I are colleagues that go back a few years. I won't bother to say how long we've known each other. We are both professors of European Studies. Michelle kindly agreed to have a look at the book and say a few words in response to my presentation. So, Michelle.
That's a really hard act to follow. And the comment I would raise is the irony of being here. Jerry is an American who's now become more Belgian and a naturalized citizen. I was born and raised as an EU citizen in Britain and Ireland, and I now live in the United States. So if transatlantic means something, it means perhaps very different places. For all of us who've taken a history class in college, the experience of writing a research paper is probably indelibly in your memory. The late nights before the paper is due, searching for primary historical sources. And if you really understand the historian's craft here, you'll know that you'll realize that history is written from what can be found, but not from what is lost. And I think that's a very important story. The past year, we've seen a lot of commemorations in Europe for the Great War. And the collective remembrance of those who died is surprisingly quite visible in a lot of the fact that war has not faded, even though it's 100 years since the Great War. We're actually visiting the landscapes and the sites of war more often than ever before. We're wearing our poppies in our lapels. We're holding public events. And we're still in our curriculum using the bleak and horrific, perhaps poetry that we find from this time period. Why do I say that? Because the legacy of war is very interesting, very present at American University, both in the munitions clearance in Spring Valley from World War I and in the SIS curriculum, where we continue to focus on violence and conflict around the globe, despite the 2 wars to end all wars in Europe. And so for every sort of collective remembrance, wearing of poppies, public events of war and remembrance, there are also personal memories, personal artifacts, and personal stories. And this book is for those of us who want an alternative view of the transatlantic relationship. That's history through the rank and file. That is the ordinary people who do exceptional things in difficult circumstances. And I want to sort of put this in context for those of us who are about the same age as Jerry and Mac and Jenny. When we shop for secondhand clothes as college students, we have no fear that there will be surveillance, that it may signify that we are collaborators or resistance fighters, and that any suspicious activity could be reported for our everyday action. But this was a reality for these people. And for many of them living through wartime, this surveillance was a daily activity. When we eat on a scheduled meal plan, we have little conception of ration books, of the black market for food, and the endless ways that you can repurpose food when you don't have the basic staples of sugar, butter, and flour. And on a personal note, I really will tell you I'm from Britain, and we had ration books until 1955. And my father tells me that the very first time he saw a banana after the war, he tried to eat it with the skin on because he'd never seen one. So the reality for people who live in that period is very, very different. This is a book, actually, for the current generation. This is a book for people in this room. That you live in a globalized world where information is at your fingertips, and where the notion of a Europe in crisis right now is simply about the high levels of youth unemployment or a currency crisis. But it's something perhaps in Europe, when we say Europe in crisis, it's about something more deeply held, the pathologies of nationalism, which we are seeing right now reemerge in many radical right movements. And so for us, the pathologies of nationalism are the destruction of war and the impact of occupation. These can really impact lives, not just on the front line where Roger and Jerry were, but also well beyond that front line. But it also goes well beyond the dates of war, from 1939 to 45, that we use as our shorthand for the Second World War. The impact of war continues after the armistice is concluded, whether it's the guilt of Mac for surviving, whether it is the continued food rations and shortages, or whether it's using one of the more horrific people in the book who was a collaborator and using him for intelligence purposes after the war, despite the brutality and betrayal of his fellow countrymen and women. All of these topics are taken up in Jerry's book. But importantly, when Jerry starts his course, he begins with post-war Europe, perhaps as a testament to the benefits of peace and prosperity that came out of this, that came after the Second World War. And perhaps because Jerry and I both teach on European integration, the message in the book is very clear. Europe chose never again. So Europe anchored itself in a set of institutions, NATO and the EU, that have been extremely durable. Both are often unloved, neglected, questioned about their relevance, about their capability, and whether the relationship between the US and Belgium, the US and the EU, is one of structural drift, functional cooperation, or if it's an enduring partnership. Jerry's conclusion is obvious from his book, an enduring partnership. Interestingly, those of us that are focused on the transatlantic relationship have heard it analyzed in so many ways. The peace dividend is over with the end of the Cold War, and so the transatlantic relationship is less central. Jerry's message is exactly the opposite. The glue or cement has not weakened over time. And Jerry reminds us very, very interestingly about something in his conclusion, especially given the events in Ukraine. There's a little quote at the very back of the book, and it says, "The transatlantic relationship must remain vigilant against adversaries is as important today as it was during the Cold War. And given the crisis in the East, I think it's a very, very apt indication. And he reminds us about, through the book, that the transatlantic relationship is this enduring partnership, but it's tied by a myriad of individuals, the Abels, the Sorensens, who resisted the hegemony of Europe as circumstances bound them together. So this sentiment of a transatlantic bond is not just two individuals in this book. It's a whole series of Belgian and American soldiers, POWs, resistance fighters, Belgian nationalists, Belgian collaborators. Jerry reminds us, for those of you who've lived in those homestays in Belgium, that oftentimes you are sandwiched between the family on the bottom level and you live in the middle level. When these people were being held in a row house in Belgium and being moved around, they were on one floor, collaborators were on another floor, and the resistance fighters were on the bottom, all living in one house together. And so it reminds us that people in the past were not so different from us, but their circumstances were. 18-year-olds in Belgium were drafted into hard labor for an occupied power rather than going to college. Journalists, writers, those who did satire before Charlie Hebdo, who sought to provide information, perspectives, and views that raised Belgian morale, or provided information via radio, print, or person about the missions and strategies or the resistance efforts to the Allies. They often did so at great risk to their own lives. And so Jerry has provided us with a wealth of material about things said and done. The constant movement of Allied servicemen from house to house is truly astounding in this book. If they moved once, they moved 15, 20 times during that summer at great risk. Many of these people had children. One of them was taken away and never returned and left a pregnant wife. They weren't that old, 21, 25, 27. And so the constant movement, they faced real retributions if they were discovered. And yet, as well as these people who hid them in this book, there's also a recognition of the internal civil war that was going on in Belgium. Many civilians were caught in the crossfire, not just by Germans, but also by the resistance movement. Many people lost their lives. And then that resistance movement, also for those of you who've lived in Belgium and sometimes spoken Flemish and sometimes spoken French, you will know that that resistance movement was very local, but it was also Catholic. It was Flemish. It was French. It was communist. It was liberal. It brought together many different ideologies. And it was not what people did to survive, but what they did to resist. They had small acts of defiance and small acts of heroism. And perhaps the most insightful one in the book was the Belgian national holiday, which the Nazis didn't realize was so important to the Belgian citizen. They got on trams, and as they passed the monuments, they either sang their songs of the national anthem or did their own salute, all in defiance of occupation. All of this is in the book. We have to understand that they were learning skills on the job, learning to be a resistance fighter, learning to be a bomber fighter. The Spartan training that these airmen received for a B-17 bomber is absolutely astounding. They had precarious jobs. Being the gunner at the back was bad enough, but being the one underneath, hanging there and looking over in a bubble was even more frightening for these people who'd spent 2-3 months training. So there were 10 men in the Wolverine, and Jerry was one of them. They were all novice fighters. They were brought down in Languedoc, and they survived a crash. And Jerry says that the resistance went looking for them, as did the Nazis. I think it's very important not to focus just on Jerry. 2 of them were sheltered by the Belgian safe houses and returned to the Air Force after Belgian liberation. 4 were captured POWs. They were imprisoned, and during the end of the war, they walked 500 miles in 3 months and were absolutely in dreadful shape when they were liberated. They survived their ordeal. 2 were captured and betrayed, tortured, and sent to one of the most notorious Nazi camps and were subsequently liberated. It's kind of ironic. Jerry was the only one that died. 9 survived from that Wolverine. And so while we remember it as the deadliest military conflict with close to 500,000 casualties, of which Jerry was one of them, we should also remember that 88,000 Belgians lost their lives. The book reminds us that ordinary people do extraordinary things. From Didi, who crossed from Belgium through France to Spain across the Pyrenees as a 20-year-old to help allies escape, to Odette, who moved soldiers across safe houses, to that Comet line. It leaves us with several issues today that I think Jerry's getting at for transatlantic relations. The first one that's very important, probably closest to his heart, is transatlantic ties still matter. Defending and promoting values which are universal in essence. Predictions about the loss of Europe's centrality, an Asia pivot because of the shifting dynamics of geopolitics have really failed to materialize. Sorensen, Abil, Schoiter, Mack believed in the importance of resistance, freedom, and democracy. The transatlantic bonds are important. And so I would say that any of the opinion polls tell you that 73% of Europeans, 59% of US support the territorial defense of Europe. It still matters. The second point that I think he might want us to make from this is small states matter. And I'm half Irish, so I truly believe small states matter. They matter because, for Jerry it is Belgium, and for Nora Lee it is Belgium. But Europe's recognized this for decades. Small states are part of the European project. They're equally important as large states. Europe is inclusive, not just because of but also it's inclusive because if you think of the expansion of those states that were left behind in 1945 and the return to Europe for those in Central and Eastern Europe. Europe has doggedly pursued the promotion of democracy, rule of law, and economic development since the end of the Second World War. It doesn't feel that way right now, being in Europe, but it is an enduring goal, and I think that's Jerry's second message. And I think his third message is individual histories matter. Your individual histories also matter. So history books are often about great events and great men, instead of depicting slow, incremental change and what may be individual action. But individual actions are what constitutes the most important and interesting facts in terms of occupation, war, resistance, democracy, promotion, and any other thing that you guys will do. And so I'm left with the social historian Carl Becker said a century ago that approaches to historical truth mean getting at the memory of things said and done. Jerry really gets at the memory of things said and done. He's been in Armadillo, Texas, Rose, Idaho. He's been in places that you guys have probably been, Tervuren and Ixelles in Brussels. And so I have one comment and 2 questions. In some ways, I think I was really struck by the words on the tombstone for Jerry and Roger. And it could have also been from my favorite poem, Dulce et decorum est pro patari mori, that sweetness is everything, you die for a cause. And I have just 2 questions for Jerry. Jerry is active in the Memorial Association for Veterans. Why Jerry Sorensen? There are 7 other servicemen from World War I and World War II that are not buried in American graves or American cemeteries. They also have interesting lives if individual history matters. So why Jerry, his namesake, and why not the other 6? And secondly, there is one character in the book that he can't find out about. And everybody else, at the very end of the book, he tells you what happened to Mac, what happened to Roger, what happened to Jerry, what happened to all those people in the comment line. But there's one person missing, and I want to ask, what happened to Odette? And I ask because she's something that I really resonate with. She's half British and half Belgian. And so from that, I would leave it and tell you, this is like reading a novel. And the question you should ask yourself is, Jerry, what next? Congratulations.
Thank you, Michelle. I know we're terribly over in time, but I'll quickly answer the 2 questions very, very fast. First question, if you go to AMDA's website, I actually have researched the biography of the other 7, so they're there. But the reason why Jerry is because of the choice he made to join the resistance. That made Jerry unique, and that's why I thought he deserved a place in history. He did something nobody else did. And as Odette, as best that Jenny knows, she married a British aviator, went to England, and has disappeared from history. But interesting enough, one of the other characters, grandchildren, one of the other minor characters in the book has read the book and has written to me and said, oh, by the way, we're living in Canada, blah, blah, blah. So I'm hoping somebody from Odette will pop into the picture as well and let me know. But I don't know. Michelle, thank you very much for that really outstanding analysis of the book. I really appreciate it. I was very, very grateful.
And thank you all for coming. Thank you, Professor Egan and Professor Sheridan. All of you, please join us for the reception outside where you can have your own touchy-feely moments with Professor Sheridan.
I have it. I thought you
Can I copy of it at some point? I can have it? Thank you.
You can have it.
That's
I
wonderful.
made it a few ad libs.
Yeah, yeah,
And I
yeah,
got
yeah,
my,
yeah.
I screwed up my Latin.
No problem at all.
But I'm a big
you.
fan.
Thank you.
So it was like reading a novel.
Thank you.
So go enjoy your moment. And it will be
wrote,
on beyond.
it wrote itself. You know, once you get into a story
Once
like
you get
this.
into a story like that, and I actually, for me, I suppose it was the smaller characters, the Odettes, and
Right.
what they did, and you know, I don't think people realize just how much, you know, rationing was, how much under surveillance they were. It's unbelievable. And it's also a tragedy that a few hours later,
Yeah,
that's for me, you know.
exactly.
But yeah, and so transatlantic relationship still matters.
Thank you.
So this is really cool. You know, you should really. It does read like a novel.
Great. I'm glad.
I finished it. I started it on Tuesday.
Great. Hello, hello.
Can you sign this?
Of course, but I need a pen. It's Joel.